In this video, we take a 180-degree turn from the previous video on monopoly, and we're going to talk about perfect competition. So, perfect competition is on the other extreme end compared to monopolists on the market structure spectrum. So, let's talk about the basic concept of perfect competition, and let's look at the market structure determinants. What is the nature of perfect competitive markets? The first obvious factor about a perfect competitive market is that there are many sellers in an environment where there are many buyers. As compared to the monopolists, there was only one seller with many buyers. And the second determinant is that there is perfect information as well as mobility in a perfectly competitive market. The monopoly had got zero information and mobility. So when the buyers have got perfect info and mobility, they can basically act on a price differential on any of the firms, right? They'll just go to the cheapest one. And the sellers, knowing this, will also be smart enough not to charge a different price from the rest of the other firms. And also, the market will be selling a homogeneous good, and there is also no barriers to entry. So, compared to the monopolist market, there are barriers to entry, of course, very high barriers to entries. And this no barriers to entries actually determines the amount of profits in the long run. Basically, a perfectly competitive firm cannot make any positive profits in the long run because when there are positive profits, other firms will come in to compete for those profits, right? So these four factors actually says something about each competitive firm. So each perfectly competitive firm actually has got low market power, and because of this low market power, they're actually price takers. They do not have any ability to set a price. The price is set by the market itself. So the market as a whole, the market together with all of its sellers and all of its buyers will set the price, not the individual firm. Another important fact about the perfectly competitive market that you have to remember by heart is that it is the most efficient market structure out there. Okay, so the one question you have to ask is, why is it efficient? Well, that's because the deadweight loss is equals to zero. And how this is achieved is that at whatever quantity that each firm produces, the price is always the marginal cost. Okay, so at whatever quantity that the firm produces, the price is always equal to the marginal cost. And this price equals to marginal cost actually creates an efficient market. So just let me show you why this is the case using a simple demand and supply curve. So the supply curve, as we have learned in the monopolist video, is also the marginal cost of a firm, right? So if the demand equals to supply, the price of good X should be P naught. So that is the consumer surplus, and this is the producer surplus. As you can see, there's no deadweight loss, but in the case of a monopoly, the price is not equal to the MC. The price is actually higher than the marginal cost at a quantity that the monopolist is producing. And that is why you have an area of deadweight loss in the monopolist market, and you don't have a deadweight loss in the perfect comp market. So another conclusion is that when demand is equal to supply and that gives you your market price, that is the case where the market is efficient. There is no deadweight loss at all. So now let's talk about the supply curve in a PC market. The supply curve is going to be pretty much different from the monopolist graphs. So your supply curve is actually the sum of all your marginal cost curves, okay? And just let me explain to you what this summation notation means. So the alphabet N on top of the summation sign over here refers to the total number of firms in the market. So let's say there are N firms. Now this over here, I'll just write it clearly, is I equals to 1. It's basically where you start the summation from. So of course, we're going to start from firm 1. And I over here refers to the number of each firm. Okay, so you've got firm 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 all the way until firm N. So if I were to expand this out into an equation, it would be the supply is equals to MC1 plus MC2 plus MC3 blah 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 all the way to MCN. Okay, so you're just basically adding up all the marginal cost curves, and I hope you remember why the supply is a marginal cost. Well, that's because of the profit maximization rule. Firms always produce along the MC curve, okay, because that maximizes their profit. Okay, if you don't remember this, just go back to the previous few videos. The monopoly video has got explanation on this. So let's say this is a marginal cost curve for firm A, and let's say that the market price is somewhere here. Okay, P naught is the current market price, okay, as determined by the market. So at the price of P naught, P equals to MC means that firm A is going to be producing X naught A. Okay, so There you have it. Then the firm is going to produce X naught A. So that is how P equals to MC determines the amount of quantity that is produced by each firm. So as you can see, the market sets the price. So the firm takes the price of P naught and it determines how much it wants to produce. Now, because this is a perfect competitive market, there are more than one firm, so we need to add up all the MC curves to get the supply curve, right? So let's just say this is firm B, and that's its marginal cost curve, and again at the price of P naught, firm B is going to be producing X naught B. Okay, so we're just going to keep adding this with the rest of the N firms, N number of firms, and then we're going to get a model of all marginal cost curves, which is known as a supply curve. Okay, so that is my supply curve, which is again the sum of all the marginal cost curves. And at the price of P naught, the total supply in the market is going to be X naught, as you can see in the graph there. So to explain this in like in a proper sentence, okay, the market supply at the price of P naught is going to be S naught equals to X naught A plus X naught B plus X naught C, blah 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 blah, all the way to X naught N, and that gives me X naught. X naught is the total supply of the market given the price of P naught. So how do we complete this graph? What we do is that we simply add in the demand curve to get the market equilibrium. Okay, but we already assume that the market price is P naught, right? So a demand and supply curve would look something like this. Okay, that P naught is the equilibrium price, right? So the market equilibrium determines P naught, so therefore for this case over here, the demand curve is drawn as such. Okay, D naught is the market demand curve. And just a quick recap, to derive the demand curve, we are simply adding up all the individual supplies from each individual consumer. Okay, and I think you have learned this in the introduction to market structures video. So this is just a quick recap on how the market demand curve is being derived. Okay, now let's move on to something that sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but I want to talk about the demand to each firm, right? Each individual firm in a perfectly competitive market. You're going to notice that the demand to each firm is actually going to be perfectly elastic. Alright, what that means is that the demand curve that each firm is facing is a flat and horizontal line. Okay, that is their demand curve. Now, let me explain why this is the case. Well, you see, each firm does not have the power to control the price, right? And we have already somewhat established why they can't control the price, but let's explain this again. If a PC firm is going to increase its price above the equilibrium price, nobody's going to buy it from them. Why? Because there is perfect information and mobility. People can just buy from the cheaper firms. If the firm is going to reduce the price, then it's going to be selling at less than the marginal cost, then the firm is going to experience a loss, right? So why would a firm want to make losses? You know, I'd rather have zero profits than produce at a loss. So that is why they don't change the price. Now, let me just show you the mathematical proof on why this is the case. Now, I hope you remember this equation from the previous video on the monopoly. This is the formula to find your marginal revenue. So this is the formula. Now, you know that the demand to each firm is going to be perfectly elastic. Therefore, the PED, or price elasticity of demand, is going to be infinity. So I guess you might be wondering, how do I divide 1 by infinity? Now, if you're going to take a really small number and divide it by a very big number, chances are it's going to be near 0. So we're just going to take that as 0. So I'm going to complete the mathematics, and I'm going to realize that marginal revenue is actually the price. And the price, as discussed in the previous few videos, is also equal to the average revenue, right? Selling two goods for $5 each, they're going to give me $10, so average revenue is 5. So the demand curve is also the price, it is also the average revenue that each perfectly competitive firm is facing. So there you have it. That is why the demand to each firm is a straight line. Okay, cool. So now that we got the basics in place, let's talk about the graphical approach to analyze perfectly competitive markets. So the first thing we always talk about is what is the basic setup to analyze perfect competition. Now, there are several scenarios that you can have in the perfect comp. So there are going to be a few players, right? That you can either have one type of consumer and one type of firm. Okay, so that's the most basic. You're going to need one market graph, you're going to need one type of consumer graph, and lastly, you're going to need one firm graph. So this is the basics. This is like the easiest scenario that you can get, simplest scenario. So I'm just going to draw 3 graphs with price and quantity, one for each of the entities that I just mentioned above. What I would recommend is that you draw the market graph first, because the market graph is going to derive the most important thing, which is your price. So that's the demand curve for the market, which is also the demand curve for all the consumers. And you have the supply curve, which is the sum of all the marginal cost curves. So the market equilibrium is at point A, and market equilibrium quantity is X naught. Market equilibrium price is P naught. So here we have got the consumer's demand, which is X naught C. That's the marginal cost. So at P equals to MC, the firm is producing X naught F, and the firm is at AF, right? So to ensure that they have got zero profits, because that's the nature of a perfectly competitive firm, we have to draw the average cost curve at where point A is. So point A is also where the minimum AC is, and that is because a perfectly competitive firm cannot have any profits in the long run. So you are actually, technically speaking, beginning in the long run. So the next kind of scenario is where you got 2 types of consumers and 1 type of firm. Again, you're going to need a market graph, you're going to need 2 consumer graphs, and you're going to need 1 firm graph. Okay, so let's not waste any time. I'm just going to speed up drawing these 4 graphs. Okay, so there's 1 for the market, 1 for the representative firm, 1 for consumer A, consumer B. Now, let's just say that for consumer A, their demand is elastic, and for consumer B's, their demand is inelastic. So you've got a flat demand curve and a steep demand curve. So the question is, what is your market demand curve going to look like? And let's also assume that there are more consumer A's than consumer B's. So what that means is that the overall market demand curve is going to be elastic, because consumer A has got the dominating effect on the overall market demand. Okay, so I'm just going to add in my supply curve, and this is going to determine my equilibrium quantity as well as my equilibrium price, right? So it's just going to draw a horizontal line across. Okay, the equilibrium price is at P naught, and then consumer A, okay, they are at point A, and that's how much they're consuming. This is for consumer B, and this is just a quick reminder. You can actually find out that this blue shaded area over here actually refers to your consumer expenditure. Okay, it's consumer expenditure because the finite area is going to be your price multiplied by your quantity. Okay, so that blue shaded area over there is the total amount of consumer expenditure on good X. So here's the marginal cost curve for the firm. Just take note of the notations. Okay, I'm being very specific with the notations so that it is easier for you to in your essays talk about, the demand curve for the consumer B's are going to shift left, therefore the consumer B's are now at point B superscript B. All right, so I'm just being very specific with the notations. All right, so we've been busy talking about the initial equilibriums. Now let's talk about the last one. Let's talk about a case where there's 1 type of consumers and there are 2 types of firms. So again, you're going to need 1 market graph, 1 consumer graph, and 2 firm graphs. Okay, so let's look at the basic setup. Let's look at how to set the initial equilibrium for this kind of scenarios. Okay, so I'm just going to go very quickly. Basically, you need graphs for your market, your 2 firms, as well as 1 consumer. Well, actually, kind of think of it, you don't really need the consumer graph, right? Because your market demand curve is really the demand curve for that particular bunch of consumers. Okay, but for the sake of formalities, let's just draw the consumer graph in. Okay, so I got my market equilibrium at point A, and again, my market equilibrium price is going to be P naught. Okay, so from there, I'm just going to draw my marginal cost curves and average cost curves for each of the firms. Right, that's the marginal cost for type A kind of firms. Okay, and at P equals to MC, they are at A superscript A, and that's the marginal cost curve for type B firms. So because they have to be earning 0 profits in the initial equilibrium, that is why the average cost curve is drawn in this manner. At X naught A and B, P equals to MC and also equals to average cost. So that is why profits is equals to 0. Now, let's talk about the different types of economic disturbances that can happen to the perfectly competitive model. Okay, so there are actually two very basic types of disturbances, basically a change in cost and a change in demand. Let's talk about the change in cost first. So as discussed in chapter 3, you can either have a change in fixed cost or you have a change in variable cost. Now, at this point, if you're not confident about the cost curves, stop the video right now, go back to chapter 3 and revise on how the marginal cost curve and the average cost curve is going to move when you've got changes to fixed cost and variable cost. Okay, if you don't understand that, this video is of no point. Now, regardless of whether there is a change in cost or change in demand, you will have to understand what are the short run as well as the long run effects of these disturbances in the perfectly competitive market. Now, we know for sure that in the short run, firms cannot enter or leave that industry. Okay, in the long run, the firms can do so. Now, let's ask ourselves why firms would want to enter an industry. Well, because there's positive profits. Why would firms want to leave? Well, because they are suffering losses, so they leave. In the short run, it is possible to have positive profits, but in the long run, you either have zero profits or you're making losses in the long run. Okay, so these are the basic mechanisms that you have to understand. Once you have this deep into your memory, it's fine. Right? Perfect competition will be a piece of cake to you. So let's just say that there's going to be a change in fixed cost. Maybe there is a lump sum subsidy, okay, to all the firms in this perfectly competitive market. So this representative firm will notice that its average cost curve is going to fall from AC0F to AC1F. Now, it is very important for you to take note that in the short run, there is no change in the quantity that is produced by each firm because the marginal cost curve did not shift. So P equals MC still happens at the same quantity. So that makes this green portion over here the area where there is profits, right? Because the price is now higher than the average cost. So the firm is making profits. Now, we're going to move on to the long run. So firms are going to enter this market to compete for those positive profits. So more firms means more marginal cost curves. And more marginal cost curves simply means that the supply in the market is going to increase. And the supply is going to increase, firms are going to enter until the profits become zero. Okay, so this is the analysis in the long run. Take note that it's increase in supply until the profits become zero. So how do we show that the firms will be earning zero profits? Basically, the firm has to be producing at this point for the profits to be zero. Okay, don't believe me? Check this out. So the supply curve is going to shift to the right to give me my market equilibrium price of P1. Okay, and just to take note of the notations over here, notice that the top part of the summation sign is now N plus K. And K here actually refers to the new firms that have entered the market to compete for those positive profits. Okay, now let's go back to the representative firm. So that red dot that you see there, now the price is equals to the marginal cost is also equals to the average cost. That is why they are making zero profits. Okay, so see, it's that simple. This is a long run mechanism, the basic long run mechanism that a perfect competitive industry goes through. Okay, I intend to take a more progressive approach in this video so that I can slowly introduce you more advanced mechanisms in the perfect market structure. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to another scenario which is simple. It's still simple, but it's a little bit more complex than the previous example that you have seen. Okay, so in this scenario, what we're going to assume is that, okay, again, there's going to be one type of consumer, one type of firm, and for that you're going to need to have graphs for each one of them, and you're going to need to have a market graph as well. Okay, so again, I will always establish the market equilibrium first so that I can get my equilibrium price, okay, which is this straight line over here. Market is at equilibrium at point A. Okay, and let's just assume that the price level is P naught now. Okay, so the firm is making zero profits. Okay, and it's producing X naught F amount of X. So the scenario is this. Basically, there's going to be a change in the variable cost. Let's say there is an increase in wages. So obviously, when there's an increase in wage, is a variable cost. So what you know is that the marginal cost curve is going to shift upwards, and so is the average cost curve. Okay, if you don't understand why, please go back to the chapter 3 videos and do a bit of revision on how the cost curve moves when there's a change in variable cost. So notice that the MC curve shifted. Therefore, the quantity produced will change. Basically, I think you'll be very tempted to conclude that in the short run, the firm will be producing at this point over here. Well, the assumption makes sense since the firm will always produce at P equals to MC, but there's something that you have to bear in mind whenever the marginal cost curve is shifting. Okay, now just remember that the supply curve is a sensitive bitch. And the reason why it is so sensitive is because the supply curve is the sum of all the marginal cost curves. Therefore, when the MC curve of the firm shifts, your supply curve is going to follow that shift just by a little bit. So the supply curve is going to shift upwards just like how the MC curve shift. Okay, so that is going to be the new supply curve in the short run. So point B actually gives you your short run equilibrium. Okay, so point B is a new equilibrium. The market price has increased, and let's check out what the firms are doing. So the firms are producing at this much, since that is P equals to MC, and basically they are making losses. All right, they're making losses because at X1F, the average cost is higher than the price level. Okay, so that is not really nice for them, right? They're suffering from losses. Okay, so we've come to the end of the short run. Now, in the long run, obviously, you know that some of the firms will leave the industry due to the losses. Well, remember, it's not all the industry, or not all the firms, it's some. And they leave when they cannot cover their average variable costs. So this means that there's going to be lesser marginal cost curves, which also means that the supply is going to fall until the profits are zero. Okay, so that is the long run mechanisms. Take note that the supply is going to drop until profits become zero again. So obviously the point where profits can be zero is at this point, which is your minimum average cost. Okay, so that is going to be your point C for the final equilibrium. So you need the price level to be there so that P equals to MC, which is also equals to AC. So just simply shift the supply curve up since the firms have left, and that will give you your market equilibrium price of P2. Okay, and that's a new supply curve. Take note that K over here refers to the firms that left the market. Okay, so point C is your final equilibrium. Okay, the total market equilibrium quantity has fallen. Firms are kind of producing more right now. Okay, and that is the final equilibrium for the consumers. Okay, I'm not going to bother so much about the amount of spending or whatsoever, because the key focus here is actually on the firms and how they behave. Okay, things like how much will the consumer expenditure change when such a thing happens. I think you're pretty well versed with it already. So here's a thought-provoking question. In the long run, we notice that the firms are increasing their production of X, but the market equilibrium quantity has fallen. Why is this so? If the firms are producing more, shouldn't the market consume more? Well, that's because the effect of the firms leaving the industry has got a larger, there's a dominating effect on the overall quantity of X produced. Okay, so that is a simple reason for this contradicting direction of change. Okay, so now we're gonna move on to something that's a little bit more complex. We're gonna level up a little bit. So same scenario, we are gonna have one type of consumer, one type of firm, and then you're gonna need your market graph. Okay, so as always, establish the initial equilibrium in the market. Okay, so you've got demand and a supply curve. So this is going to give you your market equilibrium price for the initial part. Okay, so this is the initial long run equilibrium. Again, the firms are making zero profits at this point A, superscript A over here. And okay, there we go. This is our initial equilibrium. Just remember to label all your graphs and all your lines correctly. So the scenario that I'm going to assume is that there's a change in demand. So let's say that there's a fall in demand for good X. So obviously the demand curve is going to shift to the left. The demand curve for the consumer is the same as the demand curve for the market. So the price has fallen. Obviously, this is the new market price. P1 is a new equilibrium price of good X. So what happens to the firms? Okay, they'll be producing at point BA over here because that is where P equals MC. And you notice that they have reduced their amount produced, and they are suffering from losses now. Okay, so we have now come to the end of the short-term equilibrium. So basically, you can anticipate that in the long run, because some of the firms won't be able to swallow the losses, so they'll start to leave the market, which causes the supply to fall, right? This is as per normal. So when the supply falls, your supply curve is going to shift to the left, and you would also remember that the supply will keep shifting to the left until the firms make zero profits. So you can actually draw a new supply curve as this green dotted line over here, and that will actually bring the market price back to P0, and then the firms are making zero profits. But that's just an easy way out. Let me show you a method of analyzing this such that you can actually get more marks. Okay, so it's going to make your answer more impressive. It's going to make analysis more impressive. So in the long run, some firms are going to leave. What do you think is going to happen to those labor, capital, and materials, etc. that these firms were originally using? Well, basically, they're not going to be in any more demand, right? Because there are lesser firms demanding for this. So what we call all these things are production factors. Okay, they are factors of production. So basically, the demand for production factors is going to fall. So what does that mean? Basically, using normal demand and supply concept, the price of these production factors are going to fall. And when the price of these things fall, basically, the firms now see a lower cost of production. Okay, and the lower cost of production basically means that the cost curves are going to shift down. So basically, you're going to do this analysis if you want extra marks, if you got more time. If not, just choose the easy way out if you're rushing through your exams. Okay, so what you're going to do is to shift the supply curve first. The supply curve is going to shift to the left because of the firms leaving the market, right? So let's draw a new supply curve that's in between the first supply curve and that green dotted line, okay? And that would be the supply curve for the long run, okay? Now, this new intersection at point C is going to give you a new market equilibrium price, okay? So let's just say that it's going to be P2, so it's between P0 and P1. So now all you're going to do is to make the firms earn zero profits. So I've recreated this graph so that you can see it clearer. Now, what you know is that the marginal cost and average cost curves are going to shift down because there has been a reduction in the cost of production, right? So the MC curve is going to shift down. Okay, let's just shift the MC curve first because the AC curve is pretty straightforward. Okay, so now what you're going to ask yourself next is, where is P equals to MC? Well, there it is, right? So this is going to be my final equilibrium point. And the next question is, how do I make the firm make zero profits? Very simple. Just make sure that P equals to MC equals to average cost. So point C is also where the minimum average cost is. And there you have it. By producing X2A, the representative firm is making zero profits. So that's how easy, right? That was the final equilibrium itself. Okay, we're now moving on to the last branch of this mind map. Let's talk about some of the special cases that you will encounter when you're doing perfect competition questions. Okay, so let's say there's a consumption tax or subsidy on the consumers. Okay, so this is obviously going to affect the demand curve, but most importantly, how is the demand curve going to be affected? So if it's going to be a tax, obviously the demand will fall, and when it's a subsidy, the demand will rise. Okay, but how do we express this on the graph? Okay, consider a normal demand curve that looks like this. Okay, and let's say there is a tax on the consumer, so obviously the demand is going to shift to the left. So the new demand is now D1. Okay, so what you want to do next is, when the demand curve is going to shift to the left and the demand falls, what happens in the market? Well, obviously the price level is going to fall. So let's just say that the price level has fallen to P1. So the consumer is now going to consume X1 amount of X, and how much is he paying? He's basically paying P1 plus T. So T over there refers to the per unit tax on consumption that the consumer faces. So this orange portion over here actually refers to the new expenditure that the consumer is spending on X. Okay, so let's talk about the subsidy on consumption. So let's say you have a regular demand curve that looks like that again. Okay, and the price initially is P0. So let's say there is a subsidy. Obviously, the demand curve is going to shift to the right. Cheaper stuff means more demand, obviously. So what happens in the market when the demand curve shifts to the right? Well, the market price is going to increase, let's say to P1. So how much is the consumer spending? So he's going to be consuming X1 amount, but the amount he pays is not P1. It is in fact P1 minus S. So this highlighted portion over here, this portion in orange, is the new expenditure after the implementation of the subsidy. So what you notice here is that you see this vertical distance between the old and the new demand curve actually refers to the size of the tax that is imposed on the consumer. And for this distance between the old and the new, demand curve is the size of the subsidy that the consumer is getting. Okay, so that's the easy part. Now, the next special case that we're going to talk about is kinked supply curves. You heard of kinked demand curves? Let's talk about kinked supply curves. And this happens when there are two types of suppliers. Okay, it's two types of suppliers. So one of them could be a regular supplier. So some firm that has got a normal MC and AC curve. And you got another bunch of suppliers which has got perfectly elastic supply. So what this means is that the supply curve is flat. It's a horizontal line. What this means is that they're only willing to sell at one price for some reason. Okay, so that's the scenario. We now have to combine these two demand curves together. So how's this going to go? So the first supplier obviously has a normal outward sloping curve, and let's just call it S1. And S2 refers to that perfectly elastic supply curve. Now, the general rule is this. The supplier that offers the lowest price to the market gets to supply the market. I mean, that makes sense, right? People will only buy from the cheaper source. So this red portion over here will be supplied by the first supplier because it's a lower price. So supplier number 1 supplies the market from 0x to x0 amount of x. Okay, so beyond x0, the second supplier is going to be supplying the market because its price is lower. Okay, so what you'll see is that the supply curve is actually this red shaded line. So to complete the graph, let's add in a demand curve. So the first supplier will be supplying from 0 to x0, and the second supplier will be supplying from x0 to x1. Simple. Okay, so both suppliers are in the market. That brings me to the end of this video on perfect competition. I want to thank you for studying with Quickienomics, and peace out.